Berlin was inside the Soviet territory because, as I mentioned, when the war was ending, the Soviets got to Berlin first, and then they took a bunch of territory around Berlin. So because they were occupying this, they said, no, we have this territory. But they agreed to divide Berlin up, with the Soviet Union getting about half of it. And then Great Britain and France and the United States getting equal shares of the other half. Your book shows the map of how it was divided on page 766, and you can see the Soviet Union has almost half of Berlin. Well, Berlin was located deep inside Soviet-held East Germany, and the Great Britain and France and United States began to supply Berlin with its stuff it needed, food and medicine and essential supplies. The Soviets decided to blockade Berlin, what's called the Berlin Blockade. The United States and Britain and France responded by what's called the Berlin Airlift. They used airplanes to fly over this part of there was an international agreement of airplanes flew so high they were to be left alone. So they used airplanes to fly from this part of Germany into Berlin and supply the Berliners with their needed supplies. Now that was expensive. This went on for several months. The Soviet Union realized that these truckers, if they allowed the trucks and trains to go through, they would be stopping for gasoline and for food and other supplies, and they needed the money that the truckers was. So after a while, the Soviets lifted the blockade. Round number one in the Cold War went to the West when the Soviets lifted the blockade. Now, I don't want to make it sound like the West won most of its battles. In fact, if you actually look at it blow for blow, the Soviet Union was to win most of the skirmishes during the Cold War, owing to the fact the West was not willing to fight. But round one was a victory for the West. Your book spends almost a whole page talking about speculating who started the Cold War. I hope you'll read it. I'm not going to delve into it too much, except your book says that perhaps the West overreacted. But it is known the Soviet Union did have plans to conquer the world. But then again, communism just didn't have the resources to do that. And the West may have overreacted, have been overly concerned. Each side accuses the other of starting it. Your book takes a more neutral stance. Each to his own opinion. I guess I've already told you whose side I take on the issue of who started the Cold War. Again, you're dealing with a certain man like Stalin. Everything you do is going to be wrong. If you don't, you're wrong. If you do, you're wrong. The United States practiced a policy at this time called a policy of containment. Meant we're going to communism to exist where it already is, but we must make sure that they get nothing else, that they go no farther. Now, the policy of containment did not really work, but it does explain why we got involved in Korea and Vietnam. Well, again, containment was a big part of our foreign policy for a good many years, beginning with Harry Truman, continuing through Eisenhower and into the Kennedy and Johnson administration. You don't hear much about containment after the Vietnam War. We practiced the policy of keep the communists where it is and don't let it expand. As soon as we got started in this policy, a big civil war broke out in China. Chinese Civil War. After they had worked hard together, I'm talking about now the two men, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, they worked hard together they worked together to drive the Japanese out. Your book shows a picture of two men creating a big toast promising friendship. And again, when you make these kind of agreements with certain type of people, they mean absolutely nothing. The two men were highly suspicious of each other. Mao Zedong began to work to undercut Chiang Kai-shek, and a civil war ensued. And this time, Mao Zedong and the communists won. Chiang Kai-shek, with 4 million of his men, fled to the island of Formosa, which is sometimes called the Republic of Taiwan. Different names for the same place. Now, these 4 million men said, we're going to go back to China one day and take back over. Well, that was 64 years ago, folk. By now, most of them are deceased. A few of them are old men. I mean, these were adult men when the event happened. Chiang Kai-shek himself is deceased. Mao Zedong is also gone. Mao Zedong. The United States promised Formosa that we're going to help you in some way take back mainland China, and if mainland China invades you, we'll be there to help you out. Well, folk, 64 years have gone by. Mainland China has never invaded. But if I were to go out after this class and turn my car radio and find out that mainland China has invaded, it could happen any time, I have no idea what the United States would do. No idea at all. But I strongly suspect that we would do absolutely nothing and let the communists have it and betray people we once promised to protect. Again, there's no way to tell.
Didn't we sign a?
What's that?
Didn't we sign a pact with the
Well, we signed a pact with them all, but that was under President Harry Truman. Way back 60. The reason I remember the number 64, I mean, is this occurred in the year I was born, by the way, 1949. So that's why I keep saying 64 years ago. But back at that time, we signed a pact with them where we promised military protection to Formosa. And I believe Truman would have given it. And Eisenhower came after might have. But what we would do today, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we go to war with China over that issue or not. But nevertheless, the people who live there, I mean, they intermarried with the local population, and Taiwanese are now half Chinese and half local Taiwanese, and they get along fairly well together. We'll talk a bit more about them. Taiwan has featured Little League baseball teams that have won World Series championships. Again, that's because those boys can play baseball year-round. It's in a tropical climate. American boys only play in the summertime. Anyway, the communists won, and the communists have taken over China to this day. Once the communists took over China, they proceeded to take over Manchuria and Tibet. They got back Tibet, which Tibet has gone back and forth. At times China has had them, at times China has not. There used to be a professor who had a car with a bumper sticker, and the bumper sticker said "Free Tibet." I've not seen that bumper sticker in a good many years. Either the professor no longer teaches here at this campus, or the professor traded in cars, which every one of us have to do once in a while, and never did put a new bumper sticker on his new car. Whatever the case, Tibet is still not free. Tibet is headed up by a man named the Dalai Lama, and because the United States does not want to offend China, our presidents have refused to meet with the Dalai Lama. Again, if any of you have heard of the Dalai Lama, he's the spiritual leader and supposedly political leader of Tibet's rebellion. But Tibet is not free. Tibet is still considered a part of China. And the United States will not give any assistance to Tibet to get its independence, nor will anybody else for that matter. All right. The new China, the new China was communistic, and for a while they isolated themselves from the rest of the world for many years. Eventually they opened up to the West, and of all people, President Richard Nixon was largely responsible for getting China to open up more to the world than anyone else. right. Now, in 1949, the Chinese Civil War occurred. Harry Truman was the president. And Harry Truman, of course, was greatly upset, along with the other people in his administration, because he knew that history would tend to blame him. And a lot of books were written, including one entitled I Saw China Betrayed, where they tended to blame Harry Truman and the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and a few other people high up in the Truman administration for betraying China to the communists. I think Harry Truman had this in mind when, a year later in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and the Korean War had begun. The Korean War was to last about 3 years. Well, here's why the North Korea invaded. I mean, I've read 2 books about the Korean War, and one of them, I did a report on it when I was in college for my history class, and got in front of the class and did a report. In effect, the North Koreans believed that the United States would not go to war. Now, South Korea was very, very poorly prepared for war. In fact, South Korea would have been mopped up and given over to the communists, except that President Truman ordered General Douglas MacArthur to go in and defend South Korea. Now, I'm going to sum up the war in about a minute or two. Initially, North Korea was winning. The United States got in and drove the North Koreans back, and we almost conquered the capital city of North Korea. And just about the time that we had the war won, China entered the war with their millions, and they began to drive the United States back. But then the United States sent more troops in, and we battled the Chinese and North Koreans to a standstill. Essentially, the forged the war went back and forth. Then came President Eisenhower, and President Eisenhower got the 2 sides to agree to a truce. Now, the Korean War is officially still going on. They did not sign a peace treaty. They merely signed a truce, which meant they agreed to stop fighting. But every once in a while, North Korea will take shots at South Korea. And one of you, it's a Korean fellow from the other class, did a paper on this. But these sides, they've been shooting each other all my life. I mean, there was a time when an American soldier was killed patrolling along the Korean border, and his parents said, we thought he was so lucky when he got Korea instead of Vietnam, but he wound up getting killed in Korea. There was a time when the North Koreans captured our ship, the Pueblo, and captured some of our radios, the Pueblo incident, and they kept our men hostage for 8 months. We finally diplomatically secured a release and found that our crewmen had been very severely mistreated in this incident. And more recently, every once in a while, the North Koreans will take shots at South Korea, all in an attempt to try to provoke a war. And of course, North Korea will fire missiles. Their missile shots seem to be getting better and better, and they claim they have an intercontinental ballistic missile, a missile that can reach the United States. You're shaking your head no.
They don't.
Their missiles so far have oftentimes blown up shortly after they've taken off. We have satellite images of that, but they at least they're making the attempt. And in the meantime, the United States has moved in with its equipment and done maneuvers alongside the South Koreans in an attempt to try to show the world that we will stand with South Korea. At least we make it appear that we will. Now again, if North Korea were to invade right now and with full force, I have no idea what we'd do. But at the moment, we promised South Korea. Now, when the truce was signed and the fighting stopped, at least except for sporadic gunfire, but the fighting mostly stopped, North Korea had the best of the farmland. And South Korea got land that was almost worthless, rocky, unproductive land. Now, did you hear me? I said North Korea got the best of the farmland. Guess what? North Korea is starving. Yes, you heard me right. The side that got the best of the land is starving. And the side that got the pitiful land, they're one of the richest countries in that part of the world. The United States and Japan moved in to help the South Koreans industrialize, and South Korea began to produce automobiles. The Hyundai bought up Kia, Hyundai and Kia, which now have factories here in the United States, and hundreds of thousands of Americans own. You see a lot of particularly Kias out anymore. South Korea has prospered. North Korea is starving. And again, North Korea blames all of our troubles are due to the United States. And they really believe that, folks. I mean, most people who have problems, it's the easiest thing I can do is point your finger and blame it's your fault. But no. When you start looking at yourself and pointing your finger, number one, you have a better chance of solving issues. I mean, if an alcoholic goes in for treatment, they tell him one of the first things he has to do is say to himself, the problems I'm having are my own fault. Never mind blaming my mother, never mind blaming my wife. The problems I'm having are my own doing and my own making. And I hope that takes a lot of humility to do. But it's a first step in solving your problems. North Korea has not taken that step. As for South Korea, they're prospering. I'll throw this in. I mean, South Korea is the most Christian nation on the face of the earth, and on any given Sunday they have the highest percentage of their people attending church service. I know that South Korea is still half Buddhist, but the half that are Christians seem to be very loyal. And they sit on the edge and get shot at every once in a while from across the North Korean border. They have at times given food and aid to their North Korean brethren who do not really seem to appreciate it. All right. Your book shows a picture of Stalin meeting with Chairman Mao Zedong. The two sides promised eternal friendship. And again, even among blood brethren, sometimes these treaties mean nothing. What happened is Stalin died under mysterious circumstances. Now, I said this to a class, and one pupil had a computer, opened it up and looked up, and yeah, I said Stalin's death is somewhat mysterious. There are persons who claim that I assassinated Stalin, or claim that they assassinated Stalin. And of course, the facts were hard to get because Russia did not allow reporters in, so we can only take their word for it. But we learned that Stalin had a stroke. And then we learned shortly after that Stalin was dead. There was a power struggle, but I'm going to make a long story short. At the end of the power struggle, a man named Khrushchev was to wind up winning the power struggle. Khrushchev was to govern the Soviet Union for about 12 years, which is most of the years while I was growing up. From the time I was I was 14. So actually from the time I was about 2 to the time I was 14, Khrushchev was in power. Actually I was 15. He was ousted in the fall of 1964, so I'd have been 15 years old. The reason to bring it up was we kids would often talk about him, and particularly on the playground, some of the girls would get angry at each other and say, "You like Nikita Khrushchev." Nikita Khrushchev was one of the most ugliest old men you ever saw, with a whole lot of warts on him. Or they'd say, "You look like Nikita Khrushchev," which was one of the worst insults you could hurl at each other.